doctor candidate Geraldine Anis, and she will talk about dislocation dynamics. And the stage is yours.
Thank you. Hi everyone. I'm Geraldine. I'm a PhD student at the University of Warwick, and today I'll present a bit of the work that I've done for my PhD project, focusing on dislocation dynamics in nickel-based superalloys. So a very quick intro to nickel-based superalloys. They're typically used in high temperature applications, and this is because they exhibit high strength at high temperatures. And they also exhibit a lot of interesting properties, which stem primarily from their microstructures. So we're specifically interested in these precipitation strengthened nickel-based superalloys. So these typically consist of two main phases, which are illustrated in this micrograph. So we have a disordered nickel salt solution phase, which is primarily nickel. It has an FCC or phase center cubic structure, and this is this gamma matrix that we see. And within that, these precipitate phases, which are shown here as the cubes, these are gamma prime. These are primarily nickel 3 aluminium. These have an ordered structure with an L12 structure, and this is illustrated by these unit cells here. So this is a very big simplification. So typically the composition of nickel-based superalloys is a lot more complex than this, and we can have additional elements entering both phases. But for the purpose of my talk, typically I'll be referring to gamma as a pure nickel phase and the gamma prime phase as nickel 3 aluminium. And what we're interested in is, so these gamma prime precipitates can hinder dislocation motion, and this leads to the strengthening effect, and this is what we would like to study. So our work focuses on three main points to study these dislocation precipitate interactions. So first, we would like to model the dynamics of the dislocations in these systems, and we would like to do that using physics-based modeling. So we would like physically interpretable models and parameters. The second thing we would like to do is quantify the uncertainty in both our model predictions, but also in our model parameters. And then finally, combine this into a multi-scale framework. So material deformation is really a multi-scale process. And what we're interested in doing is essentially extracting information from the atomistic scale that could be useful to study larger systems that are more representative of material deformation. And so by combining these two things, we can hopefully do that. So if we have physically interpretable parameters, that makes it easier to sort of transfer them between methods. But also what we would like to do is quantify our parameter uncertainties and then propagate those also across different methods. So previous work in this area has looked at things like parametrizing dislocation obstacle interactions. So in this specific study, the authors were looking at if inertial effects could possibly lead to a dislocation overcoming an obstacle that it otherwise wouldn't. And they used this equation of motion, which features a lot in my slides, to model the dislocation dynamics. Other things that have been done include looking at mobility laws, which essentially map out the relationship between the dislocation velocity and the applied shear stress. And finally, looking at parametrizing dislocation interactions. And all of these are examples of problems where these quantities can be then used in other length scale simulations. Yeah, so very briefly, so again, just to reiterate, in our systems, we model the gamma salt solution phase as pure nickel and the gamma prime phase as pure aluminium. So very briefly, the kind of dislocations we're interested in are these edge dislocations. They have a Berger's vector in the 110 direction, and they lie in the 111 plane. And in FCC materials, so like pure nickel, these dislocations tend to dissociate into partial dislocations. And when this happens, a stacking fault forms in between. So this is illustrated in the schematic where we have two partial dislocations, and the stacking fault is just a region of the crystal where the stacking becomes disrupted due to this. So because we would like to look at how dislocations in nickel interact with a precipitate phase, we consider a two-phase system as well. And there, this becomes a bit more complicated. So in pure nickel, these dislocations are perfect dislocations, meaning that they can move through the nickel crystal without disrupting its crystal structure. But then as they encounter the nickel-3 aluminium phase, that's no longer the case, and they can't actually enter the phase without creating another planar defect, which is this anti-phase boundary. And so the main point here is that if we're considering this two-phase system, we now have to look at a minimum of, so these dislocations will tend to move in pairs. And then also we get these planar fault formations, which really affect the dislocation. So yeah, so this is a summary of our methods. So we use molecular dynamics simulations with a classical effective potential to simulate the dynamics of a single dislocation. In the pure nickel case, we use that as sort of a case study to develop our methods. And then we also consider this two-phase nickel-3 aluminium with two dislocations. This is an animation from these simulations, so we can see that we get this, in the pure nickel case, we get this separation, and the stacking fault is highlighted in red. And once we run these simulations, we can then extract the dislocation positions from them, and we get these dislocation trajectories. So we also run several of these simulations, and we get these error bars from essentially averaging the position over several simulations, and this is just the standard deviation away from that mean. Okay, so the kinds of models we're interested in fitting are illustrated here. So in pure nickel, this is based on work that was done before. So like I showed, this equation of motion was shown to describe the dynamics of a single dislocation in a pure material quite well. And the kind of parameters we're interested in, so I said physically interpretable models. We have the dislocation mass, which controls the dislocation acceleration, a drag coefficient, and the force acting on the dislocation. And then in nickel-3 aluminium, we get this more complicated model, which we've developed based on this, and I'll talk a bit more about that in detail later. So because we're interested in also quantifying the uncertainties in our parameters, we use this sampling approach, and the specific scheme we use is called differential evolution Monte Carlo. So this is an adaptive MCMC approach. The reason we use it is because it does particularly well in converging a bit faster in situations where we have highly correlated parameters, which, as we'll see, we do. And the basic idea of this is just that multiple Markov chains are run in parallel, and the update of a chain is dependent on the state of two other randomly selected chains from the pool of remaining chains. And so a proposal is generated based on this, and then we do this within a Bayesian framework. So it's the proposal is accepted or rejected by considering the posterior distribution of the parameters given the data at that specific proposal. So this is what we've done in pure nickel. So again, just to recap, we have a single dislocation. So here we're considering the perfect dislocation by averaging the positions of the two partials. And this works well in this case because the average position represents the position of the full dislocation quite well. And so we take our equation of motion, we scale it, we non-dimensionalize it, so we get these non-dimensional parameters, and then we apply this DAMC approach to sample these parameter distributions by fitting this model to the ND trajectories that we get. So there's a few good things here. So we consider the velocity. So with that mean fit, we get the dislocation velocity and the drag coefficients, and these agree well with previous studies. And so scaling everything, everything scales properly so that the value of the force that we get corresponds to the shear stress that we actually applied to the simulation cell. And the nice thing here is that we now have these parameter distributions. So like I said, we see that the parameters are correlated, and then we can use these to generate dislocation trajectories. So sample we can sample these to generate dislocation trajectories and quantify the uncertainties in our model output, which in this case are the dislocation position and velocity. And so this is shown as the shaded region orange, and we can see that we are underestimating the uncertainty, which is a common problem, and I'll talk a bit more about that towards the end. So once we had that, we thought so going back to the third point that I mentioned at the beginning, so how can this be used to inform other methods? And we thought of essentially doing a dislocation mobility law with quantified uncertainty. So if we repeat the same process at different applied shear stresses, we can learn and then again sample the parameters in the same way. We can learn the dependence of these dimensional parameters on the applied shear stress. We can fit simple polynomials to them and then put that into our equation of motion. And we can sample then these coefficients. And to get a mobility law, we essentially consider what happens as beyond its initial acceleration phase that the dislocation goes through. So as this acceleration term goes to 0. And so we can rearrange the equation of motion and we get the terminal velocity of the dislocation as a function of the applied force. And this gives us this mobility law. And because we've done some sampling, we have these coefficient distributions. We can sample those and we can get uncertainty. So if we also take those coefficient distributions and then generate samples and plug that into the full equation, we can then compare what we get to the original MD data, and we find that we get a good representation. So yeah, so this was to just develop this framework. We want to apply that now to nickel, nickel-3 aluminium, so this two-phase system. So I just wanted to, so this is an animation from one of these simulations that we consider, and I just wanted to highlight here a few things about the stacking faults that form. So again, we start with a dislocation pair. So we have a leading dislocation, a trailing dislocation, and we want to see what happens when we drive these into the secondary phase. And we can see that we get a complex stacking fault. So this is the stacking fault that forms if the dislocation is in pure nickel. Once it's in nickel-3 aluminium, this changes to a complex stacking fault. So in addition to the disruption of the crystal stacking, we get a chemical defect on top of that, and that chemical defect is an APB as well. So the leading dislocation will form we'll get pinned at the interface for a bit. It forms the APB, and then this second dislocation will remove it. And this is what we hope to capture in the model that I'll be presenting next. So we do this, so using this setup, we do this at different applied shear stresses. So what I'm showing here is the trajectories that we extract. So again, now we have 4 partial dislocations. So we have a trajectory corresponding to each of these. These shaded regions show our phase boundaries. And so at low stresses, we see that this leading dislocation gets trapped at the interface. And then as we apply a bit more force, we can drive the dislocations through the secondary phase. And just to highlight this, so because we're looking at the partial separations can give us information about the different stacking faults and the planar faults that form in these cases. And we'll focus on this stress regime where the leading dislocation and the trailing dislocation can be driven through the secondary phase. So to model this, we extend our equation of motion. So we have the same parameters as before. So the mass, the drag coefficient, and the force acting on the dislocation. But now we also consider the effect of these different planar faults forming. So we have additional terms accounting for of the ISF, the CISF, and the APB. And we also take into account, because we have multiple dislocations, these are interacting, we take into account their interactions. So we also now consider the partials individually. So for each partial dislocation, we have an equation of motion. This results in a system of 4 equations, one for each partial, that we have to solve. And now we have 13 parameters to account for these effects. So this is kind of what we want to capture. So this interaction between, so here I'm showing a stacking fault, but this also applies to the APB. And so this balance between, because due to the energy cost of a stacking fault or a planar fault forming, this will typically lead to an attractive force between the partial dislocations, which is balanced by their repulsion. And this is what we're trying to capture in this equation. So yeah, so this results in, for this 4 partial system, in a system of 4 equations with 13 parameters that we would like to sample. So very briefly, what these parameters account for are things like the switching. So now we have to be careful when the dislocations are either in nickel or in nickel-3 aluminium. We have the external force again. We now have 2 drag coefficients again corresponding to if the partials, depending on which phase the partials are in. We have our planar fault terms and then also 6 dislocation interactions. Okay, so again, we would like to sample this. This becomes difficult because the solver becomes very expensive. But before going on to what we do there, so if we do just a simple least squares fit, we find that this model is able to capture the major features of these trajectories. Specifically, what we're looking for is things like the pinning of this partial dislocation at the interface. And also we get a good representation of the partial separation, which, like I said, just corresponds to the different planar faults that form. So yeah, so because the solver becomes too expensive to use directly in sampling, we use a surrogate model. So the surrogate model that we've chosen is this Gaussian process co-regionalization model, which is just essentially a multi-output GP model. So our inputs to the model are time and our 13 model parameters, and what we output is the 4 partial dislocation positions at a given set of parameters. So we use our expensive solver to generate the training data for this, and then once we have a good model, we can use that in place of the solver to sample these parameters. So this is so the GP surrogate model, this enables us to do this sampling. We again have parameter distributions that we can now sample, generating some sample trajectories, and we see that the model, so this is actually quite a bit of samples, but we can see that what we're fitting is quite overconfident, despite that we can see that the model is missing some of these features, and this is, again, a common problem that we would like to address next. So yeah, but in general, we get a good fit, and we still have the parameter distributions. So I'll be presenting those next. I won't show all 13 parameters, but just a couple to highlight some points and motivate some future work. So if we look at the drag coefficients, so like I said, we have 2 drag coefficients, one corresponding to when the partial dislocations are in nickel, and another one when the partial dislocations are in nickel-3 aluminium. And if we plot these from if we sample the posterior distribution that we get and we plot these against the applied shear stress, we can see that there's a stress dependence. So typically at low applied shear stresses, we expect the drag coefficients to follow this kind of relationship. We expect the velocity to increase linearly with the applied shear stress, and then that results essentially in a constant drag coefficient. At higher applied shear stresses, the dislocation velocity eventually saturates, and then we expect the drag coefficient to exhibit a velocity dependence. And we can see this if we look at the average velocities of one of our partial dislocation in the region beyond this initial acceleration phase. If we plot that out, we can see that, the results I'm showing here are in this stress regime, and we can see that we're starting to saturate. And so this explains why we have the stress dependence of the drag coefficient. So this is nice, but the other thing we're interested in are these forces from the planar fault formations as well as the dislocation interactions. So if we have a look at those, we also see that they exhibit a stress dependence, which is not expected. So the planar fault, the forces due to the planar faults and the dislocation interactions, these should only depend on material properties. We do not expect them to vary with the applied shear stress. So in the absence of an applied shear stress, the partial separation or the width of a planar fault will only depend on the balance between the attraction from the planar fault formation and the dislocation interaction. When we apply shear stress, these distances, so if we go back to these plots, we can see that, so if this represents the CISF, we can see that across the different shear stresses, these are varying, and this is probably what's being reflected with the stress dependence of these parameters. So this is something that we are going to address next. We do not expect this, and yeah. So just to conclude, so I've presented a framework for sampling model parameters and determining their distributions. We've used pure nickel as a case study. We've then extended this to a 2 dislocation system in nickel-nickel 3 aluminium. So the main point to highlight is that these are interpretable models. This allows us to so because we're interested in this sort of transferring these parameters across methods, this allows us to do that, and then we get parameter distributions that allow us to estimate and propagate uncertainties. So next is to essentially consider this velocity dependence that I've shown in the drag coefficients, explicitly apply that in the model, and then also maybe look at temperature effects. And then finally, what we would like to do is go from this kind of representation to a 2D representation, which also would allow us to take into account things like precipitate shape and size. And yeah, so I'll just end with some acknowledgements. I'd like to thank my supervisors, and all my MD simulations were done on the SCRTP systems at Warwick, as well as Thistle's Tier 2 HPC platform, and funding for my project provided by the CDT, and more recently, my EPSRC postdoctoral pathway fellowship. And yeah, so thank you for listening.
Any questions?
So I wanted to ask about when you do the Gaussian process to propagate your uncertainties, do you think it's that your distribution of parameters that you're starting from is too narrow and that's why you're getting overconfident uncertainties, or do you think it's because the GP just
I think it's more to do with this Bayesian optimization approach, because so when we're doing this, we're assuming that this model is correct. And so we're getting, so for instance, here, there's a feature that it's not capturing, but because the model doesn't have enough flexibility to do that, but that's not being accounted for. So I think it's actually this, yeah, that.
Yeah, I have a question. So when you do these parameter fitness, I'm curious if you have the data polluted by noise.
Yeah, so this is very clear here. So here we get a lot of, so I should also mention that in nickel compared to the two-phase system, so nickel, we only looked at very low shear stresses compared to the high shear stresses. In this low stress regime in the pure nickel, we get a lot of thermal noise that we are also not capturing. So this uncertainty is also underestimated because we don't have anything in our model to sort of capture that thermal fluctuations. So yeah, so it is an issue, I think, here. As we go to the higher shear stresses in the data I showed later, the noise was a bit less pronounced than this.
Any questions? Okay. Then let's thank Geraldine again, and if you have questions, we can continue. Oh. Another question I would like to ask you.
I guess the way my question is, let's say you strain the default window five unstable. Then what?
Do you mean the?
So that would be that would be quasi-static, right? If you're straining and then relaxing separately.
Let's say before. You just strain, you shear everything, then you look. It doesn't literally, you just quench. You very much think, depending on this, that's some fun.
Yeah.
And then after, it's not physical. First of all.
Okay.
You might track until there's only one.
Yeah, essentially. So okay, so
Well, you don't actually check how many else think will.
no, I don't think. I think
Take into account that specific.
It's.